But we're really honoured to have a brilliant session this morning from Nancy and Cecily, from Arts Council England and from the Art Fund. So I'll let them tell you all about what they're going to be talking about. But if you could give them a hand to welcome them, that would be lovely.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. It's a bit strange because I can't hear myself. I am Nancy. I am Senior Programme Manager at Art Fund, and I'm joined by Cecily from Arts Council, who will kind of introduce herself in a moment. So Cecily and I are here to talk about a piece of guidance that Art Fund and Arts Council published in December last year called Everybody is a Winner. So the guide brings together all of the different schemes that exist to support owners to give and sell objects to museums and galleries efficiently. On the screen, you'll see the schemes that it covers and what we'll be talking about in a bit more depth today. So we've got acceptance in lieu, cultural gift scheme and condition exemption delivered by Arts Council, we've got private treaty sales, and we've got gifts and bequests delivered by Art Fund. So when we were making the guide, the real aim of it was to raise awareness for these schemes and the significant benefits that they offer to owners and museums, and raise awareness with owners, museums, but also advisors who advise owners, so lawyers, tax advisors, so that they can spot opportunities to use them proactively. What we wanted to do with the guide was to really turn what can be quite complex information into hopefully easily digestible text, make it as easy as possible for owners and museums to identify the right scheme to use with every acquisition. Both in terms of what their tax liabilities might be, but also in terms of the owner or donor's motivation for giving. For museums, we hope that the guide is a useful tool for training staff to look out for these opportunities, but also as using the guide to send to lenders, owners, donors, so that they're aware of the schemes as well. So the title of the guide is taken from a quote from David Lammy, where he was talking about acceptance in lieu as being the holy grail of public policy. And it really is. It's excellent policy. But we're quite aware that not everyone who should know about the schemes does. And then maybe there are people who do know about the schemes, but they might not feel particularly confident to use them because of the complexities. So, we're aware that there's missed opportunities if tax advisors are working with owners of art collections and they're not mentioning these schemes as part of their advice, or if a museum buys an object from an individual and it could go through private treaty sale, but it doesn't, they're missing out on the financial savings that are available to them. So really, we're just trying to raise awareness of these amazing schemes and the benefits that they offer to both owners and museums. And also, we'd love to see a greater diversity of museums benefiting from the scheme. So there are some museums that we know are really confident using these schemes, and there are some museums that might not have used any of the schemes that we're talking about today. So we really want to kind of diversify the museums that are benefiting from the schemes. And an anecdotal example I wanted to share was someone that I know that I bumped into who's not connected to the sector. And I was talking to him, and he owned a few kind of pieces of armor that he'd inherited from a family member, and they'd been on long-term loan to a museum for quite some time. And he was saying to me that he was considering withdrawing that loan and selling the armor to pay for some tax bills that he needed to settle. He wasn't aware of these schemes, but he had conversations with an auction house who were obviously raring to consign those items. If he had been aware of these schemes, he would have known that private treaty sale and acceptance in lieu probably would get him greater returns than if he were to sell them on the open market. So we're hoping to kind of close that loop and make sure that we're not missing those types of opportunities. So in that situation, could the museum have been proactive about making that lender aware of these schemes? That owner's kind of tax advisors and lawyers maybe should have picked this up as an opportunity as well. So that's the type of situation that we're thinking about when we're publishing this guide. So I'm going to hand over to Cecily, who's the expert on all things kind of Arts Council programmes, but just a few figures to give a sense of the scale. So the first figure is 52 million. That is the value of the objects that were placed with UK institutions through AAL and CGS last year. And actually, that was £34 million worth of tax that was settled through the scheme. So that £34 million that museums aren't spending, but acquiring amazing works of art that they may not otherwise be able to afford. 729 objects were placed through Art Fund's Gifts and Requests programme in 2022. And I touched on that private treaty sale thing, which gives museums the opportunity to acquire works for around 70% of their market value. So really, really significant schemes in all different kinds of ways. So Cecily, I will hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cecily Rainey, and I'm Manager Acceptance and Lieu and Cultural Gift Scheme at the Arts Council. So the idea of my slides, the idea behind them, is to provide information to support museums and institutions in feeling confident in knowing how to identify opportunities to acquire items via Acceptance and Lieu and the Cultural Gift Scheme. So these schemes, for those of you who don't know, allow those with a UK tax liability to transfer important cultural objects into public ownership and gain a tax advantage by doing so. In most scenarios, there is no acquisition cost for the recipient institution, and the type of object accepted under the schemes are hugely varied. So to give you some idea of the variety, objects can include books, manuscripts, archives, paintings, drawings, print, sculpture, art installations and video work, textiles, jewellery, furniture and decorative art, antiquities, fossils, steam and traction engines, and collections of objects of social and scientific interest. On this slide, it shows a collection of fossils that was accepted under the Cultural Gift Scheme a few years ago and allocated to National Museums Scotland. So eligible recipients of items offered through the schemes include museums, galleries, libraries, archives and heritage bodies such as English Heritage and the National Trust. For the acquiring institution, they must care for and maintain the object and provide public access to it. The expectation is that this will be 100 days a year open public display, subject to conservation requirements, and state in any labelling the name of the acquisition scheme under which the object was accepted. So over the next few minutes, I will provide a summary of how each scheme works in a little bit more detail and highlight how eligible recipient institutions can make the most of the schemes to enhance their collections. So acceptance in lieu and how it works. So an offer in lieu is made to settle an inheritance tax bill arising in most cases after a death. Once Arts Council is alerted to an offer, this is most usually by HMRC, because all offers must be submitted to HMRC. It is considered by the Acceptance in Lieu panel, who appoints experts to advise it on preeminence, value, physical condition, and allocation. An object or collection can be offered on the basis that it is preeminent or associated with a building in public ownership or owned by a heritage body, such as English Heritage or the National Trust. With regards to allocation, offers can be made in three ways: on the condition that, if accepted, that they are allocated to a particular institution, with a wish for allocation, or alternatively, without a condition or a wish, what we call unconditional. If they are made with a wish or unconditionally, once these items have been accepted, they are advertised and institutions are invited to apply for their permanent allocation. The Acceptance in Lieu panel is an advisory body and its recommendations are approved by the relevant minister. And because it's a UK-wide scheme, that can mean ministers in Scotland and Wales as well. Once an item is accepted in lieu, it is announced in our annual report, which comes out at the end of the year. So the 2023 version came out the 19th of December last year, or via a press release before that date. And following the publication of the annual report, we upload details of any items available for permanent allocation to our website and invite institutions to apply. The image on the slide is Stephen Hawking's office. The contents of his office and his archive were accepted in lieu of tax in 2021 and allocated to the archive to Cambridge University Library and the office to the Science Museum. So the advantage to the offeror of offering something in lieu of tax is that it generates a tax credit which can be used to settle an inheritance tax liability. By offering it in lieu, a greater proportion of its value can be used to settle a tax bill. And this is because the offeror benefits from a financial sweetener which allows 25% of the tax that would otherwise be due to be remitted to the estate, which thereby enhances the value of the tax credit generated by a successful offer. The offeror has the reassurance that the item accepted in lieu will be held in the UK on public display for perpetuity, and they can also request to have their name publicly acknowledged with the acquisition. There is also a certain prestige associated with items acceptance in lieu because they've been deemed significant enough to be recommended for acceptance. The cultural gift scheme is the second scheme, a second tax incentive scheme for acquisitions. Is fundamentally different in that it's a lifetime giving scheme, and the tax reductions generated are to be used in lifetime against either income tax or capital gains tax as an individual, or corporation tax if the company wishes to donate something through the scheme. So unlike acceptance in lieu, which comes via the taxman, HMRC, the cultural gifts and application under the cultural gift scheme is made directly to Arts Council via the application form available on our website. The applicant needs to provide information including provenance details about the object they are offering, its open market value, a statement explaining why they consider it to be preeminent, and if they want the object to be acquired by a specific institution, the name of that institution. And institutions typically provide a letter expressing their support of the acquisition, why they want it, why it will enhance their collection, and so on. Offers under the cultural gift scheme are considered by the acceptance in lieu panel otherwise in the same way. And like acceptance in lieu, they can be offered on the basis that they are preeminent, standalone preeminent, or associated with a particular building. And like AIL, acceptance in lieu, the panel recommendations are approved by the relevant government minister, and once an offer is accepted, it's announced in the same way, i.e. via a press release or via the annual report. And items accepted under the scheme without a wish to allocation are advertised on our website and applications invited for their permanent allocation. The image here shows the spitting image archive that was accepted via the cultural gift scheme last year and allocated to Cambridge University Library. So the advantages to a donor of offering something through the cultural gift scheme is that, as I mentioned earlier, a successful gift generates a tax reduction. The tax reduction is set at a percentage of the open market value. So for individuals, that's 30. They can benefit from a 30% reduction based at 30% of the open market value of the object. And for companies, it's 20%. As you can see, a gift under the scheme is largely philanthropic because the rest of that value is just given outright. The tax reduction is a relatively small percentage compared to the value of the object as a whole. For individuals, they can spread the reduction. It can be applied against either income tax or capital gains tax, and can be applied against liabilities in the year the gift is registered and a further 4 years if they wish. And for companies, it's got to be applied in the accounting period in which the gift was registered and is applied against corporation tax. Donors will not be liable for capital gains tax or inheritance tax on the donation. And same as for acceptance in lieu, the sort of advantage or benefit to the donor is that they have the reassurance that the item or collection will be held in the UK on public display for perpetuity. They can have their name publicly acknowledged with the acquisition. And like acceptance in lieu, there's a certain prestige because objects have to be deemed to meet a certain standard to be accepted under the scheme, recommended for acceptance. So, top things to consider when talking to private collectors and potential offerors interested in using the schemes to donate something or offer something to your museum or collection. Does the owner want to make a gift in their lifetime or on death? You can establish that and help identify the relevant scheme. If they are considering an offer in lieu on their death, will there be inheritance tax to pay on the estate? The age of the owner, the tax reduction generated by a cultural gift is lost if not used up before death. So sometimes waiting and offering after death via acceptance in lieu, if there's an inheritance tax liability, might carry less risk for an owner. And some things to note for the cultural gift scheme: donors need to be registered for self-assessment to apply the tax reduction generated by gifts. It can't be applied via PAYE. And items which are owned jointly or in common cannot be given under the scheme. And an object held in trust cannot be given through the scheme either. So lastly, I'm going to touch upon conditional exemption, which is kind of related to sort of government measures to protect important cultural property in the country. It's different to the cultural gift scheme and acceptance in lieu scheme in that it's not an acquisition scheme. But I mention it because it does present certain opportunities to museums to borrow objects and put them on display, objects which have been conditionally exempt. So conditional exemption allows owners of preeminent cultural property to defer the payment of inheritance tax or capital gains tax arising from a change of ownership of the property. Usually this is following a death or a transfer in ownership. And this deferral is made on the condition that the owner undertakes to provide public access to it, to keep it in the UK and to maintain it. Claims are made by the owners of the property to HMRC, and HMRC then seeks the advice of the acceptance in lieu panel as to whether items claimed for exemption meet the required preeminent standards. The image on the slide here is of a piece of jewellery which is exempt and is on display or at the V&A. So conditional exemption, the opportunity for cultural organisations. For owners of objects claimed for exemption, lending objects to a museum or gallery is an effective way of ensuring that the requirements around public access are met. Cultural institutions can be proactive at offering to borrow and display the items. The owner might consider offering the object in lieu of tax after their death. So that's another advantage. So they can put it on loan in their lifetime to defer the inheritance tax bill. And then when they die and the inheritance tax bill is triggered, they can then offer it in lieu to the institution that's borrowed it. HMRC has a heritage assets database available on their website, which lists all items for which exemption has been granted. And so interested institutions can search the database and, in theory, approach the owners of items if they want to suggest that would they be interested in lending the object to them, and they can provide the public access that's required for it. If the owner chooses to sell an item which has been exempted, they must alert the Arts Council so that we can put a notification about the sale on our website. And most public museums and libraries can then purchase the exempt item at a reduced price via something called a private treaty sale, which Nancy's going to touch on a bit later. So opportunities to look out for. Look out for objects advertised for permanent allocation on our website. So the slide, I'm afraid, is a little outdated. It mentions items currently on our website available for permanent allocation. These have now been taken down because the panel made recommendations on the permanent allocation of those items earlier in the year. But this year, the things we advertised included a group of material by Lieu and Freud, etchings, copper plates as shown here, drawings and an unfinished oil painting, and 152 prints produced by the master printmaker Alan Cox of artists including Dia Alazawi, Dame Paula Rego, Sir Terry Frost, Tracy Emin and Sir Eduardo Palazzi, to name a few. You can sign up to receive an email alert when a notification of an intended sale of an exempted item is placed on the Arts Council website. So if you're interested as a museum in purchasing it, you can consider your options to do so via private treaty sale. And two further suggestions of opportunities to be proactive when it comes to initiating conversations with private collectors around acceptance in lieu and the cultural gift scheme with owners are: one, bringing the topic up when negotiating loan renewals. and to using the publication of the updated version of the Guide to Giving, as mentioned, as an opportunity to send it to lenders and make them aware of the schemes and what's out there if they wish to donate something and the kind of advantages to them of doing so. And my last slide just has some web links for the pages on our website where you can find the objects advertised for permanent allocation when they're up there. And the next lot will be advertised after the publication of this year's annual report. So they'll be advertised from kind of December onwards through to about end of February. And also the link to sign up to receive an email alert for a private treaty sale notification. And also included is the email address for sending inquiries about acceptance in the cultural gift scheme. Okay, thank you, and we'll head back to Nancy.
Thanks, Cecily. That nicely segues me on to talking about private treaty sales. So private treaty sales are a way of selling tax efficiently. So if an owner sells their object to a public institution using private treaty sales, that sale is completely tax-free. In order to benefit from this mechanism, sellers need to be UK taxpayers. They need to be liable for capital gains tax or inheritance tax if they were to sell on the open market, or corporation tax if they're a company. So going back to David Lammy's quote about everyone being a winner, he was talking about acceptance in lieu, but it also applies to private treaty sale as well. The seller receives more than they would if they sold the item at auction, and the museum makes a significant saving as well, paying around 70% of the market value. So as with acceptance in lieu, cultural gift scheme and conditional exemption, private treaty sale can be used for a range of heritage items, so not just kind of works of art. A few things to note around private treaty sale. The object needs to be deemed preeminent, so it may have already been granted conditional exemption, as Cecily was speaking about, or HMRC will consult the Arts Council acceptance in lieu panel on whether the item meets the preeminent criteria. Really, I think that if an item is of interest to a museum, it probably does meet that preeminent criteria, so I wouldn't be kind of put off or scared by that kind of preeminent label. Another thing to note is that funders like Art Fund, we do expect museums to be looking at doing the kind of due diligence around the different tax incentives available to them when making an acquisition, so that we're making the best use of charitable and public funds. Another thing to note is that if it's the right situation, then if you're acquiring an object that has been export stocked, it may be that you buy it with a private treaty sale mechanism, which means it'll be much cheaper. Cecily talked about acceptance in lieu and cultural gift scheme, that their panel will commission advice to decide on a fair value for objects. This isn't the case with private treaty sale. It's slightly different. The price is decided with a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. And with that in mind, to aid with things like valuation, negotiation, tax advice, and general kind of hand-holding, a seller might choose to get support from a professional advisor, like a freelance heritage advisor or an auction house. So it's important to factor in that those costs might be added to that eventual sale price, but they're not paying tax and they're not paying kind of buyers or sellers premium, so it's still a significant saving. So yeah, I do recommend looking at the guidance document, but also Arts Council's website, which has got a really helpful kind of guide to private treaty sales in more detail. It's got some kind of example calculations and some kind of steps for museums to follow when using private treaty sales. So who can benefit from private treaty sales? In order to acquire through private treaty sale, an organisation needs to be what we call a Schedule 3 body, which basically just means they are listed in the Schedule 3 of the Inheritance Tax Act of 1984. The full list is on HMRC's website, but essentially it's national museums, local authorities, universities, national trust, etc. But if your museum doesn't fit into this category, for example, you might be an independent museum, that doesn't prevent you from benefiting. Art Fund is a Schedule 3 body, so we are able to front a purchase and essentially buy the object and then immediately gift it to the museum. So even if you're not listed on the Schedule 3 list, but you are eligible for Art Fund support, you can still make use of this mechanism. And actually on the screen, I've got an example of a sale that we fronted for Stanley Spencer Gallery. And we've recently done a similar sale for Paxton House as well, fronting that acquisition. Perhaps on the other end of the spectrum to private treaty sales is Art Fund's Gifts and Bequests program. Art Fund offers a free service to owners looking to gift or bequeath works of art to public institutions. The service is part of our charitable offering and has been for our entire 120-year history. In fact, we are best known for our acquisitions grant, but the first work to ever be art funded was a gift 120 years ago. So unlike the schemes that we've talked about before, there is little financial advantage to using these schemes, with the caveat being that if someone leaves something in their will to a charity, then they don't have to pay inheritance tax on the value of that gift. Plus, if they leave more than 10% of their estate to charity, they qualify for a reduced inheritance tax rate. But really, this scheme is for people who are less interested in financial savings, for whatever reason that might be, and more interested in advice and support with finding the right home for their work of art. So we find that lots of owners are philanthropically rather than financially motivated. They may have less tax to pay, which makes the other schemes that we've talked about less interesting. Or they may just not be interested in going through all of the kind of paperwork necessary to go through the schemes that we've mentioned earlier. And we find that there's typically not a kind of standard art fund donor. They come to us for a number of different reasons. Maybe the kind of most important one being the advice that we can give on who the appropriate museum might be. We often say that it's not the obvious choices. It's, quite often organizations come to us with kind of Tate or something like that, but we can show them a collection where that particular piece might be really valued in different ways. And we also like to encourage donors to choose museums that don't benefit as much from philanthropy. We also give kind of more general advice on estate planning. So we get involved quite early on. We go and visit donors at their homes and view their collections and advise them on the options available to them, which does include the different tax incentives that we've talked about. So donors might choose to give one or two items through cultural gift scheme or acceptance in lieu, and then the remainder of their estate they might leave in their will to Art Fund to distribute to museums and galleries. Another motivation for giving through us is the fallback option. That obviously, if you give directly to a museum and then they don't want it, then it just reverts back to the estate. Whereas if you give through Art Fund, if their first choice museum isn't able to take the piece for whatever reason, we will kind of go back to the drawing board, research alternative options. So the donor has that kind of peace of mind that we'll kind of do whatever we can to get that work of art into a really good home. Another reason which is coming up more often recently is around our terms and conditions, which a museum needs to sign with us in order to receive a gift or a bequest. So some donors, particularly kind of older donors who can kind of hark back to previous times, are anxious about the future of their gift, that the work of art might be sold or disposed of for financial gain. So by giving or bequeathing through Art Fund, there's that additional reassurance that Art Fund has a vested interest in their object. And if the museum, for whatever reason, does want to deaccession their work, then we will help to find an alternative home for it, and it can't be used as a financial asset. And actually, recently, this has come up as being quite helpful for museums too. We've heard from council-owned museums who are kind of struggling financially, where Art Fund's terms and conditions has helped them to protect their collection from being sold off. So it works both ways in terms of the benefits. Relationship management. We are fundraisers ourselves, and relationship management is a big strength of ours. So Art Fund acting as an intermediary between the donor and the museum kind of takes the pressure off both, really. We also absorb a lot of admin support, and I think that's particularly attractive for someone who's planning their will. They know that Art Fund will work with their executors to help them to kind of find the right home for the work, and we all absorb things like storage costs, transport costs, communication with the museum. We put the formal paperwork in place. And then the final points are just around donors that come to us because they're Art Fund supporters. They might be National Art Parks members, or they might be Art Fund donors. And so they like to give through us because of the additional publicity that a gift might get, or that they just, like the work that they do, that we do, and they want to support us. So how and why can museums take advantage of the scheme? think it's important to say that we're not trying to cannibalize on direct gifts and requests to museums. We only want to step in if we can make a gift happen for whatever reason. I had a conversation with the museum director who I know really likes to put donors in touch with us because he feels that it looks less grabby. So if we can help in that way, we're delighted to. That same museum, I'm going to be accompanying them on a trip to visit a donor to advise them on their collection. So do bring us in if it helps in that way. I mentioned about our T's and C's and donors' anxieties. So if you're ever talking to a donor who does display those kind of anxieties, then you can use this as a mechanism to kind of give them additional reassurance. Some museums, if you don't have a development team, corresponding with Art Fund may be kind of an easier solution for you than directly with a donor who might be particularly difficult. We're happy to step in and help with that relationship management. And also, if a donor has a big collection and your museum is only interested in a couple of pieces from that collection or a portion of that collection, you can bring Art Fund in to advise that donor on what they might do with their broader estate. We're particularly keen to hear from museums about kind of areas that they're actively collecting in, so we can keep museums in mind when we receive offers of gifts. And also we're finding that we're quite often being offered kind of entire collections that donors ideally would like to keep together. So we're interested in if there are any museums who don't collect in a particular area but would like to start a capsule collection, and that a donor's kind of carefully collected collection might help them to do that. So yeah, please do get in touch if that's of interest. And that's it in terms of from Cecily and I. Here's a few things if you're interested in anything that we've talked about today. Obviously read the guide. It's both on Art Fund and Arts Council's website, but Google something like Guide to Giving Art Fund and it'll be the top link. At Art Fund, we have what we call a museum bulletin, which is a monthly bulletin with sector news, Art Fund news, and we will sometimes advertise gifts and requests through that bulletin. And as Cecily talked about, Arts Council have their annual reports for AAL and CGS, which are really, really interesting reads around the stats to do with the schemes and also all of the different objects that are being placed with museums through those schemes. So thank you. Any questions?
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Hopefully that was really interesting, being a lot to take away. We have got a few minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, we've got a roaming mic and our speakers are happy to take a couple. Has anyone got one? Alternatively, I think you have got a stand, have you, as well?
Yeah, Art Fund, we've got a stand. So I'll go and hang out there if anyone wants to come and ask any questions.
That's brilliant. But please give our speakers a hand. Thank you very much for coming along to the session today.